Debate on the Centenary of the Native Land Act of 1913.
Honorable Deputy Speaker, let me join you in congratulating Honorable Stone Sizane and Doris Fakude for their elevation and assure them of my and Honorable Kubai's unqualified support. Honorable Deputy Speaker, Honorable Deputy President, Honorable Minister Gugile Nkwindi, as we reflect on this question of land, let's focus on the land and the native question, their political, cultural, social, and economic impact on South African society. Since the arrival of the European settlers in Southern Africa, African kings and queens led wars of resistance against land dispossession, slavery, colonialism, and colonial exploitation. In 1885, Western powers met in Berlin, where they agreed to partition and share Africa, disregarding the cultural and territorial integrity of African peoples. At the end of the 19th century, African leaders were conquered, giving colonial powers the opportunity to start the process of colonization of the continent and exploitation of its natural resources. Black people participated on both sides of the Anglo-Boer War, hoping that in the event of victory, they would regain their civil and political rights, land and its natural resources. Instead, the Britons and the Boers reconciled at the expense of black people by legalizing the color bar in terms of the Treaty of Vereeniging of 1902. Soon thereafter, the Lagden Commission recommended a territorial segregation between black and white. This was followed by the establishment of the whites-only Union of South Africa, which made the Governor-General the supreme chief of all native communities and dressed him with powers to appoint or dismiss any traditional African leader at his pleasure. It was largely those traditional leaders who resisted colonization and exploitation who were deposed. The Constitution of the Union of South Africa laid a firm foundation for a racially based society, destruction of African kingship and queenships, and land dispossession. The Voortrekkers forcibly occupied the land of local communities, forcing local communities to wage wars of resistance. When these communities were conquered, for instance, the Transvaal Republic began to demarcate the land into native locations, forcibly driving Africans into them, disregarding their cultural and territorial integrity, sanctity of historical landmarks and religious sites, and denied them access to natural resources they needed to satisfy their basic needs. It is this racially based constitutional system that allowed the white minority government to pass the Land Act of 1913 and the subsequent Land of 1936. The colonial forces treated African peoples as subhuman and treated the prisoners of the wars of resistance harshly. For instance, after the Jameson raid, the Matabele captives were marched from Botswana to the Cape Colony, where they were sold into slavery. In the Greater Letaba area, 400 Balobedu women and children were marched from Mujaji's Kloof to the outskirts of Pretoria, where they were indentured. More than 5,000 cattle belonging to Queen Mujaji and her senior traditional leaders, notably Chief Makhuba, were confiscated and distributed among white farmers. However, African people who continued to farm, notably Pisli Isaka Kaseme, were more successful than the white farmers. To address this challenge, the white farmers appealed to the Union government to outlaw the purchase of farmlands by black people. In response to the racist Union Parliament passed the 1913 Land Act, which allocated only 7% of the total surface of South Africa to the black majority. The resulting overcrowding, deforestation, and land hunger forced the racist Union Parliament to increase the land allocated to African people to only 13% of the total surface of the country. The land allocated to Africans was divided into native reserves, which were barren and less productive, and forced Africans to reduce their livestock. Thus, the seeds of poverty, unemployment, and inequalities and general underdevelopment were sown at that time. This forced Africans to migrate to white farms, households, and mines to seek jobs. The slave wages were repatriated to the native reserves to sustain their families. The migratory labor system left African women and children alone in the native reserves. To a large extent, these female-headed families had to fend for themselves. The influx control laws were introduced to prevent these families from joining their husbands in the white areas. Thus was the social cohesion of African families and communities eroded. The destruction of African kingdoms and queenships was consolidated by the Native Administration Act of 1938, number 1938 of 1927, which empowered the Governor General as the Supreme Chief of all native tribes to appoint native commissioners for the administration of native affairs. The native chiefs were appointed by the Governor General and held office at his pleasure. This tribal system of government was used to keep Africans outside the main politics of the country. The formation of the ANC in 1912 and their deputations to the United Kingdom, protests by women led by Charlotte Motshekga, and the trade union movement led by Clement Gadali, and demands for the Black Republic led by ANC President Josiah Gumede yielded no fruits. Instead, the Nationalist Party came into power on the platform of apartheid in 1948. The National Party refined the racial policies of the Union government, which came to be known as apartheid colonialism. The apartheid authorities introduced the Group Areas Act 1950 to consolidate racial segregation in the urban areas. Meanwhile, African peoples had participated in both World War I and II, hoping that in the event of victory, they would regain their civil and political rights. The ANC even documented the national grievances of African people in the 1923 and 1943 Bills of Rights. The failure of colonial and apartheid authorities to address their grievances gave birth to radical African nationalism led by the Youth League of Nelson Mandela and Anton Limbede, who were profoundly influenced by the Harlem Renaissance and Marcus Garvey's radical Pan-Africanism. The ANC Youth League introduced the 1949 Program of Action, which demanded the right of African people to self-determination and the land and its natural resources. This program laid the foundation for the struggles of the early 50s, the Women's Charter of 1954, and the Freedom Charter of 1955. The Freedom Charter provided a blueprint for a post-apartheid constitutional vision, which found its way into the 1996 South African Constitution. The Freedom Charter sought to reconstruct the country fragmented by apartheid to build a united, non-sexist, and prosperous country. The Freedom Charter was adopted by the people of South Africa as a whole, both black and white. The people demanded a government based on the will of the people as a whole, sharing of the land by those who work it, recognition of the cultures and traditions of all national groups. In sum, the Freedom Charter demanded the political, cultural, social, and economic rights of all South Africans, black and white. The people's demands notwithstanding, the apartheid authorities adopted a host of legislation which turned the native reserves into homeland governments. This legislation was applied arbitrarily, further fragmenting African communities regardless of their cultural unity and territorial integrity. Thus, apartheid sought to reverse the gains made by the African National Congress towards the formation of a socially cohesive nation. In the process of establishing the homeland system, the native reserves were redemarcated, new tribes and chiefdoms created, while some chiefs who were defeated and exiled and other kings or chiefs were reduced to the status of indunas. One of them is Chief Tswale from Mujajis Kloof, who is with us here today. He's in the gallery. There are still chiefs and communities that are landless, that are internally exiled by colonialism and apartheid. For instance, Matiza of Luonde, Masakona, Magoro, Maupa, and Makoba in Limpopo are landless chiefs. They are in exile in the country of their birth. The creation of the homeland system deepened and entrenched the roots of poverty, unemployment, inequalities, and underdevelopment in general. The situation is the greatest threat to our democracy, South African and African agenda. The current rural development and land reform policies and programs, as well as claims for the restoration of kingdoms and queenships, are an integral part of the reconstruction and development of the new South Africa envisaged by the Freedom Charter. There are many communities, especially the Khoisan, who did not lodge their land claims before date and who were dispossessed before 1913. The land concerned also included sacred and historical sites of indigenous African communities. The other challenge is that since the opening of the land claims process on December 31st, 1998, only 5.6, I learned correctly from the minister that it's 8% of the land has been restituted. The slow process of land restitution resulted in the land hunger for housing and development, creating a scramble for communal land and demands for title deeds to give to rural people, which can create further problems as the banks would attach the land. Communal land is linked to the history, identity, spiritual and cultural heritage of the people.
Your time is up, Honorable Member.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Let me conclude by saying the land reform is in good hands of Minister Gugile Nkwindi. What a good choice by the African National Congress.
Thank you.